Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome back to The Book Thing. And today I'm going to be looking at a piece of, I'm not quite sure whether to say comic fantasy sci-fi. I don't know, it's somewhere in between. But anyway, Mogworld by Ben Yahtzee Choshaw. And when I say Yahtzee Choshaw, I do mean that Yahtzee Choshaw, who is quite well known for doing, of course, the Zero Punctuation series. He's written for the Escapist magazine for ages. He's published some of his own games, but also, as I relatively recently discovered, has written some books as well. And Mogworld is, in fact, his first published novel back in 2010, I believe it was. So it's not bad for a first novel. It's definitely not bad, but it's not great. I mean, it's okay. You know, it's a mildly entertaining read. I think that's the most positive thing I can say about it. That and the fact that there were a couple of moments that did genuinely make me laugh out loud, which is quite a rare thing, actually. But there were only those one or two moments. And it was down to basically a repeated joke that was... It was pretty funny and didn't overstay its welcome. It was quite well judged in that way. But otherwise, as for the rest of it, well, I don't know. It's slightly above average, I'll put it that way. And considering the competition is, the likes of the Discworld series, Terry Pratchett, and who else does comic fantasy? Tom Holt, and there's probably other names I'm forgetting. It reasonably well compares, but it's definitely not at that quality level. Although, having said that, it's maybe a lot closer to Tom Holt than Terry Pratchett. So Mogworld is, I'm trying not to say too much that's spoilery here, it's a comic fantasy novel, but there is this connection with video games, and it becomes apparent, I think, relatively early on that there is this connection with video games. Hell, the actual dedication is to Blizzard Entertainment for the 3 months of my life I will never get back. So World of Warcraft obviously has an influence. I think games like Dwarf Fortress have an influence. Oddly enough, I think the film Tron probably has an influence as well. I'd be highly surprised if Yahtzee Choshaw had never seen Tron. I think he strikes me as exactly the kind of nerd that would probably like that film quite a lot. So there's definitely a lot of influences that you can read in this book, and it doesn't ape anything particularly. It's quite good in that it's not trying to copy somebody else's style. It is definitely trying to do its own thing, and it doesn't fall into some of the more common cliches of hero adventure stories, because the protagonist, well, they're not a hero, but they're not really an anti-hero either. They're just supposed to be this ordinary guy. Jim, in fact, is the character's name. He can't even remember his surname, and he's bouncing through these adventures most reluctantly, and basically, very early on, and this is not really a spoiler because this literally happens in the prologue, he dies and then is resurrected back to life, and basically spends quite a lot of the rest of the book trying to die again because he's not very happy being undead. And so that maybe, tells you some of the tone of the rest of the book. It's not at any point trying to be serious or address any deep philosophical issues or anything like that, because it's all very heavily narrated in Jim's voice, essentially, and he's not interested in any of that stuff. He just wants to die again, basically. So it could have tried to go down different routes, this novel, but it didn't, and it's probably a good thing that it didn't, because I don't think it could have been carried off otherwise. But as it was, as I say, it was mildly entertaining. It did make me laugh out loud in one or two places, and that's not a bad start. That's not a bad thing to say about somebody's first novel. So there's not too much more I can say about it without deeply spoiling what happens later on. Instead, what I'm going to do is read a little bit of the prologue for you, and this is going to be a pretty short video compared to my usual books videos, but it just maybe speaks as to the fact that I didn't find this a terribly consequential novel. It was a mildly entertaining read, but I don't suspect this is going to be sticking around on my bookshelf. I think I'll probably be taking it along to one of the local charity shops and somebody else can maybe, take a crack at it and enjoy it more than I did. I don't know. But it's not to say it's a bad book. It's just, didn't really have that much of an impact. Anyway, so, the prologue. A dream about my father chasing me through the fields with a pig sticker took an even more nightmarish turn when he started emitting a rhythmic, high-pitched screech. Then I swam dizzily into full wakefulness to find an alarm sprite floating through the dormitory. It had to be an emergency. They didn't deploy alarm sprites lightly. It takes 2 fairly high-level mages to shut the damn things up, and I'd spent enough time at St. Gordon's Magical College to know that any emergency involving magic is something you want to get away from as fast as you can. After a minute of confused bustle in which dressing gowns were thrown on and several sets of slippers thudded their way downstairs, I and the rest of the second years followed the squealing ball of light into the entrance quad. The ear-molesting noise was immediately joined by the screams of several other alarm sprites as the rest of the student body filed out into the pre-dawn gloom. That's when I knew that something was really wrong. An alarm in itself wasn't that unusual, especially not in the second-year dorm. After spending the entire first year learning theory and taking the mandatory psychological tests, students tended to be overly enthusiastic with their first firebolts, but a full evacuation of the entire student body, 57, and faculty, 4, wasn't usually necessary. "Jim," called Mr. Everwind, my tutor. Sweat was dripping from the brim of his pointy hat. "Line up the second years at the back." We were too rattled to do anything but obey, taking up position behind the third years. All of the students had been arranged by year into a rather haphazard rectangle that didn't seem to have anything to do with the usual drill procedure. Suddenly, the sun began to rise, spilling orange dawn over the rolling green hills of the surrounding plains. I noticed the horizon was a lot more textured than I remembered, and more bristling with siege weaponry. An army was advancing towards the school. Just as I had done on my first day, I deeply resented the fact that St. Gordon's Magical College was not, in fact, a castle. "All right, chap, settle down," said the headmaster, resplendent in his star-patterned cardigan as he strode back and forth in front of the student body. "Let me assure you that there is absolutely no reason to panic." The rising tension was not eased in the slightest. "It's probably just some misunderstanding. Stop chewing, Haverson. But a Stragnoffian army appears to be attacking the college. Now, don't worry, you are only here as a precaution. We have enlisted a former graduate, Ponyleaf the Enchanter, and his adventuring party to aid us. And I want you to show them the same respect you showed to me. Understand? I said spit that out, boy." Ponyleaf was tall and thin, with a curly beard and the kind of rugged tan and fidgety nervousness that comes from a career adventuring through the gnoll and goblin-haunted wilderness. He stepped forward, separating himself from a bored-looking Ladian dwarf and a poorly dressed Anoresian warrioress who looked chilly in every sense of the word. "Good morning," he said with a cough, turning his staff over in his hands. A furious, ongoing roar was slowly edging into earshot, punctuated by the clash of swords against shields. "Good morning, Mr. Ponyleaf," droned the bewildered student body dutifully. Now, what we're dealing with here is a loose alliance of student fighters from the warrior schools just over the border in Stroganoff. Obviously, not much of a match for veteran adventurers like us. They're here because the King of Stroganoff has put out a quest to recover the Stone of Solomus, which was left with this college by its founders hundreds of years ago. Now, obviously, we will never surrender the stone to such bully boy tactics, but I would ask that I and my fellows be allowed to look after the stone for its protection, and so that we can wave it at the enemy for purposes of psychological warfare. "We don't have the stone," said the headmaster as Ponyleaf met his gaze hopefully. "You what? We've only been open 6 years. There's no such thing as the Stone of Solomus. The king's mad. Last year he made his son marry a koi pond." An awkward silence passed, or at least it would have been a silence were it not for the increasingly loud war cry and wet thudding of booted feet upon the dewy morning grass, not to mention the subtle clinking of light armour as the 2 other members of Ponyleaf's adventuring party attempted to shuffle towards the back gate, unnoticed. "Can I be perfectly frank?" said Ponyleaf eventually. "We're kind of only doing this because we were hoping you'd let us have the stone as a reward." Well, that's obviously not going to happen. No, I see that. He looked behind him and did a double take that was just a little too obvious. Sorry, it seems my colleagues have wandered off somewhere. I'm just going to see where they went and come right back. Then he left, quickly. The frontmost rank of armoured frat boys was now over the last hill and had broken into a run. The ground was quivering in almost perfect synchronisation with my stomach. Right then, said the headmaster, tight-lipped, eyes fixed on the fence over which Ponyleaf had just vaulted. I know most of you didn't really expect to be practising this level of combat magic this early in your career, but I think I can say that if I were an invading army, I'd certainly be given pause for concern by such a formidable rank of enchanters as... God damn it, Haverson, I told you once before about... The vibrating rear half of an arrow suddenly appeared in his temple. He concluded his sentence with a few spit bubbles before falling over. A large chunk of our defence force took this as the invitation to run away, but I didn't. Furious tears were forming in my eyes. I'd spent my last vegetable tray on tuition fees. Home was at least 5 turnips worth of journey away, and, more to the point, the last place I wanted to go. St. Gordon's might not have been the most prestigious magic college in the world, and its graduates generally couldn't entertain any ambitions beyond running a pest control business, but it was all that I had. The creaky wooden gates were pulverised into splinters under a whirling cloud of iron boots and training warhammers. I extended a hand and began to incant. Arcanus! Infernus! I don't remember if I was able to get a firebolt off. I have a vague memory of seeing orange light splatter harmlessly against a spiked breastplate, but that might just have been sparks from all the metal rubbing against metal. Then there was a sound rather like a bag of wet laundry being hurled across a gravel driveway, and that was the first time I died. So it continues much in that same vein. Yeah, I mean, it kind of does feel a bit like a pastiche, but then there is, I suppose, quite a good reason why it feels like a fantasy pastiche, why it does feel like quite a familiar thing, and it's not like the world itself is not anything particularly different. It's not particularly new. It's not like the Discworld. It's not trying to cobble something together out of all these different things that then become something in its own right. Now, this is very definitely deliberately referencing all those kind of generic fantasy worlds that you see in games and other fantasy novels and films, and in a way it makes it just not stand out at all, but it is quite deliberate, and so at least it's an actual stylistic choice and not just intellectual laziness on the part of the author. And it does all end up being it does all end up having a purpose, a point. It does all end up that this is for a very specific reason. And in the end, well, it had a moderately satisfying conclusion, but yeah, I don't know. This isn't one I maybe can particularly recommend unless you're like me and you're just curious to read something written by Yahtzee Choshaw. As a novel, as a fantasy novel, as a comic novel, there's definitely better stuff out there. And if you have read this and you have enjoyed it, then you might well like the works of Tom Holt as well. But his work is rather variable as well. Some of his novels are dramatically better than others, and he definitely has a weakness for conclusions, for endings, Tom Holt. Some of his books have very unsatisfying endings, but anyway, this one, however, at least was, as I say, moderately satisfying. So that's Mogworld by Yahtzee Choshaw. Not bad, I suppose, but yeah, not that great either. So hopefully you've enjoyed this and found it useful and interesting and entertaining and whatever else. And if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.